Part 1, A New Face in Town. The neighborhood I lived in had always been the picture-perfect depiction of suburban serenity. Rows of neat houses lined with white picket fences, children laughing as they played on sidewalks, and neighbors greeting each other warmly during evening strolls. It was the kind of place where everyone felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked at night, confident in the security and comfort of their peaceful community. Everything started to shift subtly when Mr. Reynolds arrived. He moved into the house directly next to mine, a modest yet charming home that had been vacant since old Mrs. Harper moved away to live with her daughter in another state. At first glance, Mr. Reynolds appeared to be nothing short of pleasant. He was a middle-aged man with neatly combed dark hair streaked lightly with gray, and always dressed in understated yet impeccable clothing. His demeanor was quiet, gentle, and unobtrusive. Initially, Mr. Reynolds integrated seamlessly. He politely introduced himself to the neighborhood, attended community gatherings, and was seen doing ordinary things like mowing his lawn, reading on his porch, and taking leisurely evening walks. He waved casually whenever he saw me walking my dog, Bella, a lively golden retriever who always tugged eagerly at her leash, curious about this newcomer. Mr. Reynolds would smile softly, kneel to pet her briefly, and then continue on his way without further conversation. Yet, it wasn't long before small, unusual incidents began to surface, slowly disrupting the calm fabric of our neighborhood. The first sign was the disappearance of Mrs. Thompson's beloved Siamese cat, Mr. Whiskers. Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly woman who adored that cat as her only companion, tearfully knocked on every door asking if anyone had seen him. Posters went up on lampposts and community boards, yet no leads emerged. Soon after, the Johnson family reported that their energetic little terrier, Max, had also vanished without a trace. The Johnson kids were inconsolable. Anxiety began to creep into the conversations shared over garden fences and in grocery store aisles. Though nobody explicitly said it, there was a growing unease, something felt inexplicably off. Despite these troubling disappearances, Mr. Reynolds maintained his usual quiet presence. Occasionally, I would see him in his yard late at night, standing still and gazing thoughtfully into the darkness, as if lost in deep contemplation. It was unnerving, but not alarming enough for anyone to openly question him. However, whispers gradually grew louder among the neighbors, wondering if the timing of these incidents might somehow be connected to the arrival of this enigmatic new resident. Most dismissed the idea quickly, embarrassed to suspect such a mild-mannered individual. But the seed of suspicion had already taken root in my mind, though I kept it firmly to myself. Then, things took a turn from troubling to frightening. My close friend Laura, who lived directly across from Mr. Reynolds, suddenly stopped answering calls and texts. Concerned after 2 days of silence, I decided to check on her. Knocking firmly at her door, it unexpectedly swung open with a slow, eerie creak. Inside, the house was untouched, pristine, but utterly deserted. An unsettling silence pressed down upon me as I stepped inside cautiously. Laura, who always meticulously locked her door, was nowhere to be found. Her purse, phone, and keys lay untouched on the kitchen table. When the police arrived, their investigation uncovered nothing suspicious, no sign of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. They treated it as a simple missing persons case, promising they'd do their best, yet their calm demeanor did little to soothe my growing dread. Returning home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beneath the surface of our idyllic neighborhood. My instinct screamed at me to pay closer attention. As I stood by my bedroom window, anxiously glancing toward Mr. Reynolds' darkened house, I resolved that I couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. I didn't yet know the depth of darkness that awaited, but my quiet, peaceful life had already begun to unravel. Part 2, Vanishing Acts. Laura's disappearance hit me harder than I had expected. She was always so reliable, so consistent. The idea of her simply leaving without notice was incomprehensible. The neighborhood's atmosphere shifted dramatically after this event. What was once subtle unease quickly evolved into overt fear. Conversations grew hushed, eyes darted nervously at every unusual sound, and the once welcoming community felt strained and suspicious. As days passed with no sign of Laura, a pervasive dread settled over us all. Other residents began locking doors and windows at night, something previously unheard of in our secure little enclave. Even Bella seemed restless, pacing and growling softly at night, her eyes fixed anxiously on Mr. Reynolds' house. I found myself frequently watching Mr. Reynolds, unable to quell the nagging suspicion that he knew more than he was letting on. He continued his quiet routine, yard work, reading, evening strolls, as if oblivious to the growing tension around him. Yet, something subtle had changed. His smiles felt forced, his greetings hollow, his eyes somehow darker, colder. One evening, while walking Bella, I saw Mr. Reynolds engaged in conversation with Mr. Bennet, a usually friendly and open neighbor who now appeared visibly uncomfortable. Mr. Bennet ended their brief chat abruptly, quickly returning indoors. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached Mr. Reynolds, pretending casual friendliness. He regarded me carefully, his smile slight but unconvincing. "You've been quiet lately," I ventured, trying to sound conversational. "Just settling in," he replied smoothly, though something in his voice felt guarded. "I enjoy the peace here." His emphasis on peace felt oddly sinister, making the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Hastily excusing myself, I walked away feeling his gaze linger on my back. In the following weeks, more disappearances rattled our neighborhood. First, a delivery man who frequented our streets vanished mid-route. Then, the kindly old gardener, Mr. Simmons, disappeared during his usual morning rounds. Each case added fuel to the growing fire of anxiety within me. Desperation for answers drove me to approach the authorities repeatedly, but their skepticism persisted. Frustrated and increasingly isolated, I felt compelled to take matters into my own hands. My nights became sleepless, my days consumed by worry. As the community unraveled further, I knew I needed evidence, solid proof of the darkness hidden behind Mr. Reynolds' gentle facade. Determined, I decided that I would begin surveillance, hoping to uncover the sinister truth before anyone else vanished. Little did I know just how deeply I'd soon become entangled in a nightmare beyond anything I'd imagined. Part 3, Watching and Waiting. Determined to unveil the truth about Mr. Reynolds, I took every precaution to remain unnoticed. My first step was installing discreet security cameras around my property. Positioning them carefully, I ensured they captured every angle that faced Mr. Reynolds' house and yard, as well as any possible entrances to my own home. Each night became an anxious vigil, poring over the camera footage, searching for anything suspicious. Initially, nothing extraordinary appeared, just Mr. Reynolds' routine activities, the typical comings and goings of neighbors, and the occasional wandering animal. Yet, my determination didn't falter, I knew patience was key. Then, on the sixth night, I found something that made my blood run cold. At precisely 2:47 a.m., Mr. Reynolds stepped out onto his porch carrying a large, black garbage bag. His movements were cautious, deliberate. Glancing around briefly, he walked slowly toward the dense woods at the edge of our neighborhood. My pulse quickened as I watched the grainy footage of him disappearing into the trees, returning nearly an hour later empty-handed. The following night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him, to see firsthand where he went and what he was hiding. Dressing in dark clothes, I quietly exited my house, heart pounding so loudly it felt deafening. Keeping a safe distance, I trailed Mr. Reynolds as he carried another large bag into the forest. Hidden behind a thick cluster of trees, I watched as he stopped near a small clearing, illuminated dimly by moonlight. I observed silently, breath caught in my throat, as he methodically began digging into the earth. Every movement sent shivers down my spine. He deposited the bag into the hole and covered it meticulously with dirt, smoothing the ground until it appeared untouched. Suddenly, Mr. Reynolds paused, turning sharply to scan the area around him. Fear gripped me so tightly I nearly gasped aloud. He seemed to stare directly into my hiding place, his eyes reflecting eerily in the darkness. Seconds felt like hours before he finally turned away, seemingly convinced he was alone. He quickly left the clearing, leaving me trembling in silence. After he vanished, I cautiously approached the spot he had dug. My hands shook as I knelt down, noticing fresh soil disturbed beneath my fingers. Part of me wanted to dig immediately, to unearth whatever horrors lay beneath, but fear and caution prevailed. Instead, I marked the spot carefully before hurrying home, thoughts swirling chaotically in my head. The next morning, armed with what little courage remained, led the police to the site. To my utter disbelief, the ground appeared untouched, no evidence of disturbance remained. The police officers exchanged skeptical glances, their patience visibly thinning. Embarrassed and confused, I returned home more frustrated and frightened than ever. My investigation had drawn attention, and whispers of paranoia began circulating among neighbors, isolating me even further. Yet, despite my growing fear and isolation, I knew I had seen something deeply sinister. Mr. Reynolds' polite smiles no longer deceived me, I had glimpsed the monster lurking beneath. As the neighborhood grew quieter and more withdrawn, I realized that I was now the focus of Mr. Reynolds' careful attention. His gaze lingered longer, his smiles colder. My determination strengthened, driven by the desperate need to protect myself and the dwindling number of neighbors left. What I didn't realize yet was that my silent surveillance had already marked me as his next target. Part 5, No Escape. Nightfall brought an oppressive stillness, an eerie silence filled only by distant rustling leaves and Bella's restless pacing. I had fortified my home as best I could, barricading doors and windows, checking the locks obsessively. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Mr. Reynolds had made his intentions clear, and it was only a matter of time before he made his move. Hours passed in anxious anticipation. My eyes were glued to the security monitors, watching every shadow that flickered across the screens. The digital clock ticked methodically, each passing minute intensifying my dread. It was just after midnight when the cameras suddenly went dark, the screens displaying static interference. Panic surged through me as I realized the wires had been cut. My pulse quickened as Bella started barking frantically at the back door. I rushed over, peeking cautiously through the blinds. Mr. Reynolds stood motionless in my backyard, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. His calm, expressionless face stared straight at me through the thin gap in the blinds, a chilling smile creeping slowly onto his lips. "I told you curiosity was dangerous," he said calmly, his voice just loud enough to carry clearly through the door. Bella's barking intensified, her protective instincts kicking in fully. "But I suppose you had to learn the hard way." Without warning, the back door exploded inward, splintering violently as Mr. Reynolds forced his way into my home. Bella lunged fiercely, but he swiftly sidestepped, sending her sprawling across the room. My heart broke hearing her whimper, but fear paralyzed me. Reynolds moved steadily toward me, his movements precise, unhurried. In a burst of desperation, I turned and ran toward the front door, hoping to reach the safety of the street. But just as my fingertips brushed the handle, his powerful grip closed around my wrist, wrenching me painfully backward. "Leaving so soon?" he whispered coldly into my ear. My breath came in short, terrified gasps as he tightened his grip, immobilizing me completely. "You wanted the truth, now you'll see exactly what happened to your friends." He dragged me effortlessly through the shattered back door and out into the cold night air, my screams swallowed by the oppressive darkness surrounding us. We moved swiftly through the woods, the branches clawing at my skin as I struggled helplessly against him. We arrived at the same clearing where I had watched him bury those mysterious bags. Only now, several freshly disturbed patches of earth surrounded us, each marking a horrifying secret beneath the soil. "Welcome to your new home," he said, forcing me onto my knees beside one of the holes. "You insisted on discovering my secrets. Congratulations, you found them." Desperation surged through me as he began to push me toward the freshly dug pit. Adrenaline gave me one final burst of strength, and with every ounce of energy I had left, I twisted sharply, breaking free momentarily. Stumbling backward, I grabbed a fallen branch from the forest floor, swinging it wildly. Caught off guard, Mr. Reynolds stumbled, losing his balance just enough to give me space. Without thinking, I sprinted blindly through the trees, heart racing, driven purely by survival instinct. Emerging from the woods, I collided with flashing lights and shouting voices. The police had finally arrived, alerted by neighbors who heard the commotion. Officers rushed past me, weapons drawn. Moments later, Mr. Reynolds emerged from the trees, hands raised, eerily calm despite his capture. The horror of that night never truly left me. Reynolds was arrested, and investigators uncovered the grim truth he'd hidden beneath our peaceful suburb. Yet, despite surviving, my life would never return to normal. The innocence of my neighborhood had been shattered irreparably. As the police cars drove away, their sirens fading into the distance, I stood alone in the dark, quiet street, understanding with chilling clarity that true evil often hides behind a friendly smile, and sometimes, it's closer than we dare to believe.